Good Tuesday morning, Edwardsville students and guests. So today we have a conversation about Richard Nixon. Tomorrow we are going to meet at 1 p.m. for a Zoom meeting. Hopefully you've seen the email about it. If you have not, please reach out to me through email and get a hold of me at kbaker@ecusd7.org. Or phone a friend who did get the email. I bulk emailed the parents, and some of it may have gone to spam. I can't fix that. Check your spam. Tell your parents, check their spam folders and adjust their settings appropriately. So today we are on the Nixon years, and this is the third set of notes within the Vietnam and Nixon folder on Edmodo. So we are going to begin our discussion by saying that Richard Nixon is a candidate who made his name much in the same way as Joe McCarthy did. McCarthy, of course, was a known communist hunter. He played on the fears that Americans had. Nixon, I'm going to not use the word play for him because I think Nixon meant it. Nixon was an ardent anti-communist. He was often at press conferences with Joe McCarthy, and oddly, when Joe McCarthy finally fell from grace and his political career ended, Nixon was unfazed. Nixon's popularity remained strong because America, of course, had a strongly anti-communist perspective. So Nixon and Kennedy ran against one another in 1960, and Nixon, seen here on slide 2 on the cover of Esquire Magazine, does not get he's seen here on the cover of Esquire Magazine, but in 1960, during a debate that was televised, one of the first televised presidential debates, Nixon did not allow the makeup to be put on him. And those who watched on television said at a 60% rate that Kennedy won. But those who listened on the radio at a 60% rate said Nixon won. So Nixon resonated well with the American people, but he didn't have the optics for it. They said he looked sick because he didn't have makeup on when he was on television. So here in Esquire Magazine, it says Nixon's last chance. This time he'd better look right. So he's going to defeat Hubert Humphrey in 1968 to become president. He only got 43% of the popular vote, and in 72 he'll get 60% of the vote because America is dividing itself, and those of voting age tend to oppose the countercultural revolution. They tend to support the war in Vietnam. Of course, the older half of America votes more, and the older half of America supports an anti-communist war with a president who is an anti-communist leader who is, of course, conservative. Now, I say conservative, but Nixon will do some very liberal things. And we'll talk about that tomorrow. But Nixon was supported by an entire Hollywood apparatus. A lot of older actors, singers, songwriters, artists. You may not recognize any on this list. I'm telling you, this is a who's who of figures in media and in popular culture back in the day. And they all sided with Nixon because they all sided with a normative culture and rejected the countercultural revolution. Nixon did some things to help himself out in 1968, like appearing on Laughin. There was a time when no president had been on a television show. It was considered to be beneath the office of the president and beneath a presidential candidate. So Nixon broke that pattern and appeared on a sketch comedy show called Laughin with Rowan and Martin pictured here with Nixon. He's also on the cover of Esquire Magazine with the caption, "Getting hep to the Nixon style." That just means hip. The people who published magazines were not 100% aware of the Urban Dictionary back then, nor did they have access to it. When Nixon gets elected, he escalates the Vietnam War in a way that is simply massive. It says increasing the intensity of bombing campaign on the slides in Edmodo. I've said twice already that it's a dramatic increase. Nixon drops more bombs on Vietnam than all sides in World War II dropped anywhere in the world, and that's a lot. When he took office, about 300 American soldiers were dying each week, and Nixon, again, had an optics problem. This is the first war that was completely televised, and every casket that came back to the D.C. area on an airplane to Bolling Air Base under an American flag was televised. And every day, caskets were coming off of airplanes and being buried at Arlington Cemetery, and it was a steady stream of media that the American people were receiving. And just as Uncle Tom's Cabin and the media played a role in affecting the Northern support of the Civil War, just as the televised brutality of Eugene Bull Connor in Birmingham against African-American protesters changed the minds of Northerners in the Civil Rights Movement, so too will the constant imagery of soldiers who had given their lives, who had lost their lives, being brought home in caskets. And Nixon's optics problem will build over time until American citizens had had enough of seeing it. Nixon thought he could end the war in a favorable way for America by pursuing what was called the madman theory. And I'll read this for you. Nixon said to Bob Haldeman, "I call it the madman theory, Bob. I want the North Vietnamese to believe I've reached the point where I might do anything to stop the war. We'll just slip them the word that, for God's sake, Nixon is obsessed with communism. We can't restrain him when he's angry, and he has his hand on the nuclear button. And Ho Chi Minh himself will be in Paris in 2 days, begging for peace." Well, that is a poor exit strategy. The reality is that Ho Chi Minh understood the West really well. He understood that nuclear weapons were off the table, just as they were in Korea, because one launched nuke leads to a second oppositional nuke getting launched. And neither the United States nor Russia could launch nuclear weapons. That's why there was a proxy war in Korea and a proxy war in Vietnam in the first place. It's because nuclear weapons and a direct confrontation between the superpowers simply could not occur. So Nixon approved a secret bombing campaign of North Vietnam. This is one of the things that was revealed in the Pentagon Papers that I talked about yesterday. He also signed off on an invasion of Cambodia without a declaration of war. There is simply a pattern of misinformation and disinformation from the executive branch to the American people over time that eventually builds up. And once the Pentagon Papers are published, the administration, at least for their Vietnam policy, loses the faith of the American people. Nixon, I will admit, pursued the Truman Doctrine, but he was not a great negotiator. His Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, was known for a fairly strong, rigid, inflexible position regarding communism. Here we see Nixon with Indira Gandhi, and I've got a list of world leaders who have associations with the countries listed there. And here are some problems that we get into. Nixon tried to kill Castro in Cuba and failed, and he was scared that Castro would try to kill him. And so he developed a policy. The Nixon policy says that no American president will ever attempt to assassinate a head of a foreign state. And so when George Bush fired a missile at Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, he said, I wasn't trying to kill him, I was trying to hit the radio in his hand, which is a bit disingenuous. But Nixon created a policy to say we wouldn't kill foreign leaders so that hopefully no foreign leader would try to kill him. Nixon supported a coup in Chile. He gave military assistance to Israel. He was involved in the support of the Shah of Iran, leading to the Iranian Revolution, which we'll talk about later. There are a list of things that Nixon did in terms of foreign policy that may not have been great long-term choices, but he saw them only as a result of short-term gain to oppose communism. And I would say that characterizes most American realities during the entire Cold War. What we do during the Cold War is pursue a series of short-term gains, and we don't see the bigger picture. I've already received several responses from yesterday's video concerning did we learn our lesson, and I've not had a yes vote yet. Many of you have indicated that you do not believe that our government understands long-term consequences when starting a conflict somewhere in the world. On slide 10, we are going to talk about the Watergate scandal tomorrow. It may be helpful if you know something about Watergate. The Watergate is a hotel and office complex. And this is what will sink Nixon. Not Operation Menu, not the bombing campaign, not Cambodia. Nixon does some good things. Nixon created the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. All those have been largely dismantled by the Trump administration. Nixon finally is the guy who got around to honoring Native American treaties. You got to respect that. So he opposed communism. America loved that. He sometimes did some dirty things to oppose communism, and I will say America loved that. He tried to protect our environment. People like that. He honored our treaties. Nixon, I got to admit, there is a way that you can view Nixon positively. And overall, I see Nixon as a relatively positive president historically. Unfortunately, he will be done in through a series of bad decisions that are all aimed at short-term gain. And we'll talk about that tomorrow live. Hopefully you have the link. Maybe you show up early, maybe you don't. It'll take a little while. We've got the space for an hour, and I hope to see you tomorrow on Zoom. Have a great day.